quiet hills of central France, just outside the small village of Glozelle, lies one of archaeology's strangest and most controversial puzzles. It began, as many mysteries do, with a simple accident. In 1924, a teenage farmer named Émile Fradin was ploughing a field with his grandfather when the earth gave way beneath their horse-drawn plough. The soil collapsed into a small pit, and what they found buried below would ignite a decades-long academic war that still smoulders to this day. Inside the shallow chamber were dozens of clay tablets, inscribed with symbols no one could immediately recognize. Alongside them were strange artifacts, bones, tools, ceramic pieces, and what appeared to be rudimentary idols. Émile and his grandfather had no formal training, but they knew enough to understand that these objects looked ancient. They carefully gathered the items and reported their find to local officials. Soon, experts descended upon Glozelle, and what they discovered would challenge everything the academic world thought it knew about early European civilization. The clay tablets were the most baffling. Covered in linear, abstract symbols, they resembled writing, but in no script known to historians or linguists. They bore no obvious resemblance to Latin, Greek, Etruscan, or any known Proto-European system. Some scholars said they resembled Phoenician or Iberian scripts, while others argued they were complete fabrications. But one thing was certain: if authentic, they could radically rewrite the history of literacy in Western Europe. Initial tests and analyses were inconsistent. Some experts dated the artifacts to the Iron Age, others claimed they were medieval. A few radical voices argued they were from the Neolithic period, potentially over 5,000 years old. That dating, if true, would mean that writing existed in central France thousands of years before the Romans arrived, and possibly before Mesopotamian cuneiform, long believed to be the earliest writing system on Earth. This possibility sent shockwaves through the French academic establishment, but not everyone was thrilled. Prominent archaeologists began to raise suspicions. Why hadn't such important relics been discovered earlier? Why did the tablets not match any known linguistic patterns? And why did so many of the artifacts appear oddly preserved, as though they had been recently fired or handled? The most vocal critic was Dr. Salomon Reinach, an influential French archaeologist, who publicly denounced the discovery as a hoax. He accused the young Émile Fradin and his family of faking the artifacts, possibly to attract tourists or academic fame. Reinach and others pointed out that some of the bones and tablets appeared too clean, too conveniently ancient to be genuine. Rumours swirled that Fradin had purchased clay from local merchants and baked the tablets himself in a bread oven. Fradin, humiliated and infuriated, sued for libel, and won. In 1932, the French courts sided with the teenage farmer, ordering Reinach to pay damages and publicly retract his claims. For a brief moment, it seemed Fradin had been vindicated, but the court's decision didn't quiet the debate, it only deepened the mystery. In the decades that followed, scholars, linguists, and independent researchers would make pilgrimages to Glozelle. Some walked away, convinced they had seen proof of a lost civilization, a literate society that existed in prehistoric France and vanished without leaving a trace. Others insisted the entire thing was an elaborate prank, fueled by a mix of rural ambition and academic wishful thinking. More than 3,000 artifacts were eventually unearthed at the site, including carved bones, glass beads, engraved stones, and more of the enigmatic tablets. And yet, even as the collection grew, so did the confusion. The writing on the tablets remained undeciphered. Carbon dating produced conflicting results. Some items tested as ancient, others as relatively modern. In one case, a bone was dated to the 15th century, while the tablet it was buried with appeared to be thousands of years older. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Glozelle site is its isolation. No similar tablets have ever been discovered elsewhere in France or Europe. If the site belonged to a larger cultural group, where are the other sites? Where are the settlements, the tools, the graves? Glozelle stands alone, like a whisper from an alternate version of history, one that either shouldn't exist or never did. Even the layout of the site caused debate. The artifacts were found in stratified layers that didn't match typical archaeological patterns. Pottery fragments from different historical periods appeared jumbled together, almost as if someone had mixed them intentionally. Was this evidence of fraud, or of a sacred site used for centuries and layered with symbolic meaning? Decades after their initial discovery, the glozal tablets remained unsolved, and more than that, unclassifiable. Linguists and cryptographers from across Europe took a stab at the script. They mapped its characters, counted symbol frequencies, and searched for repeating structures. Some insisted it was a hoax. Others were convinced it was a new form of writing, perhaps a transitional script between ideograms and phonetics. But no one could read it. The mystery deepened, and with it, the divide between believers and skeptics. One of the first to propose a serious decoding attempt was Dr. Otto H. Muck, a German researcher with an interest in ancient languages. He believed the glozal script bore similarities to Iberian scripts from ancient Spain and even hinted at links to the lost Tartessian language. Others compared it to the Linear A of Minoan Crete, one of Europe's other great undeciphered scripts. But despite these comparisons, the glozal symbols remained frustratingly resistant to interpretation. They looked like writing, but if so, they belonged to a lost tongue spoken by no known people. Some symbols resembled Latin letters, others looked vaguely Semitic, and a few even mirrored ancient Asian scripts. This curious blending of forms only added to the confusion. Was this evidence of early transcontinental contact? Or was it the work of a clever forger, designing characters to seem ancient but meaningless? While mainstream scholars mostly distanced themselves from the controversy, fringe theorists stepped in to fill the void. Some claimed that glozal was the last remnant of a forgotten civilization, a culture that predated the Celts and perhaps even the Sumerians. According to these theories, the Glozelians, as they were dubbed, were a literate, semi-urban people whose existence had been wiped from the record, possibly by natural catastrophe, invasion, or deliberate historical erasure. One particularly bold hypothesis suggested that glozal was connected to Atlantis. The symbols on the tablets, according to this theory, were Proto-Atlantean. The idols found at the site, with their bulbous eyes and abstract faces, were held up as depictions of a lost priest class. Naturally, mainstream historians dismissed these ideas as speculative fiction, but they couldn't offer a satisfying explanation either. And then there were the oddities. Some of the bone artifacts displayed carvings that appeared microscopic in detail, etched with such precision that even modern tools would have struggled to replicate them. One tablet had symbols so small and intricate they could barely be seen with the naked eye. This led some to believe the tablets were not created to be read by people, but by gods, spirits, or other entities. It was an eerie thought, but not unheard of. In many ancient cultures, writing was considered sacred and hidden. Could the glozal script have served a ritual purpose, intelligible only to initiates? In 1983, new radiocarbon tests were conducted by reputable laboratories. The results, though not conclusive, challenged earlier skepticism. Some tablets were dated to between 300 and 800 CE, placing them in the early medieval period. Others appeared to be significantly older. The Freydin family, still guardians of the artifacts, used these findings to argue for the authenticity of the site. But critics weren't satisfied. They pointed out that carbon dating can be skewed by contamination, and that not all items had been tested independently. By now, over 3,000 objects had been catalogued from glozal, stored in the private museum of glozal built by Émile Fradin himself. Despite the sheer volume of artifacts, the academic world still treated the collection with suspicion. Museums rarely requested exhibits. Major journals avoided the topic. The word glozal had become a red flag in professional archaeology, an academic no man's land. But even as institutions turned their backs, interest from alternative historians and amateur researchers only grew. The glozal site became a pilgrimage destination for the curious, the open-minded, and the conspiratorially inclined. Psychics, dowsers, and mystics began visiting the site, claiming to feel energies or receive visions from the objects. Some described glozal as a kind of ancient memory vault, holding knowledge not meant for the modern world. Was it all a misinterpretation? a misunderstanding amplified by academic pride and small-town ambition? Or was it something more, a genuine glimpse into a chapter of history that's been overlooked or deliberately erased? What makes Glozell so enduring is not just the mystery of the tablets, but the tone of the mystery. Quiet, unresolved, oddly persistent. There is no clear fraud, no smoking gun, no confession. If it was a hoax, it was one so elaborate, so artful, and so restrained that it fooled both believers and critics for nearly a century. And if it wasn't, then it's something else entirely. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire ruled by Kublai Khan stretched farther than any empire before it. It covered most of Asia and reached into Europe, a powerful machine of conquest and control. But after dominating the lands of Central Asia and China, Kublai's ambition turned toward the sea, to a small, proud island nation that refused to submit to him, Japan. The Japanese, led by the Kamakura shogunate, didn't respond to Kublai's letters or demands for tribute. To a ruler like Kublai, silence was the ultimate insult, and so, in 1274, he prepared an invasion. Around 900 ships set out from the Korean peninsula, carrying roughly 30,000 troops, Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans. They crossed the sea and landed on the shores of Kyushu. For a moment, it looked like they would succeed. The Mongol army brought advanced tactics, tight formations, heavy archery, and even primitive explosive weapons, which stunned the samurai defenders. But Japan was not easy to take. The terrain was unfamiliar, and the Japanese resisted fiercely. And then the weather turned. A typhoon swept in suddenly, smashing ships against the rocks and pulling them under. Many invaders drowned. Survivors retreated in chaos. The Japanese saw the storm as divine intervention. They called it kamikaze, a wind sent by the gods to protect their land. The Mongols had come with fury but left with nothing. Still, Kublai Khan did not give up. The failed invasion only deepened his determination. Over the next 7 years, he planned an even larger assault. He ordered the construction of a massive fleet, over 4,000 ships, and raised an army of more than 140,000 men. This would be the largest naval invasion the world would see until the 20th century. Kublai spared no expense. Forests across China and Korea were stripped for lumber. Ports were expanded. Blacksmiths forged weapons around the clock. The empire's resources were stretched to support the campaign. In 1281, the second invasion was launched. The plan involved 2 separate fleets, one from Korea and one from southern China. They would sail separately and meet off the coast of Japan for a joint strike. The Korean fleet arrived first, and again landed near Hakata Bay, the same location as the earlier invasion, but this time they faced stone walls, reinforced defences, and samurai who had learned from the past. The Mongol troops couldn't break through. Night after night, Japanese boats harassed the invaders, burning ships and ambushing supply lines. Meanwhile, the southern fleet, carrying the majority of the Mongol elite forces, was delayed by storms and poor coordination. When it finally approached the Japanese coast, the 2 fleets struggled to merge as planned. Then came the turning point. Another typhoon arrived, larger and more violent than the one before. What happened next is hard to fully comprehend. Winds howled, waves rose like mountains, and ships splintered like kindling. The ocean swallowed the invaders. Men clung to debris or were pulled under. Thousands died without ever reaching land. Ships sank by the hundreds. Those who survived the storm were often killed by Japanese forces as they washed ashore. The Mongol navy was erased in a matter of days. This second divine wind wasn't just a storm, it was a complete and total disaster. Kublai Khan, sitting in his distant palace, had lost the largest fleet the world had ever seen. He had sent over 4,000 ships, and almost none returned. Japan was never invaded again. Kublai's dream of conquest across the sea had ended not by battle, but by nature. But the mystery doesn't stop there. For centuries afterward, historians and scholars debated the truth of the invasion. The only surviving accounts were Japanese chronicles and folklore. There were no Mongol records describing the defeat in detail. No wreckage had been found. Many doubted whether the fleet was as large as described. Some even wondered if the story of the storm had been exaggerated to inspire national pride. For a long time, it was a legend, powerful, patriotic, but unverifiable. Then, in the 1980s, divers exploring the seabed near Takashima Island found something strange. Pieces of old wood, iron nails, anchors, ceramic pots, weapons, human bones. What they had stumbled upon were the long-lost remains of the Mongol fleet. Archaeologists began carefully excavating the underwater site. Over the next few decades, they found entire sections of ships preserved beneath the sand. One ship, found buried beneath silt, was so well preserved that researchers could measure its structure. Its design matched ancient Chinese shipbuilding methods from the 13th century. There was no longer any doubt. The Mongol fleet had been real, the invasion had happened, and the sea had kept its secrets for over 700 years. When the second Mongol invasion fleet vanished beneath the waves in 1281, it seemed to take its secrets with it. For centuries, the only record of the failed campaign came from Japanese texts that described storms, divine winds, and a miraculous defense. The Mongol side of the story was largely silent. Unlike other military defeats in Mongol history, there were no detailed chronicles, no memorials, and no monuments. It was as if the greatest naval invasion of its time had simply vanished. But this silence only made the mystery more compelling. How could the most powerful empire in the world lose such a massive fleet and leave behind so little trace? The number of ships lost, the quantity of men unaccounted for, the lack of preserved Mongol documentation, all of it created a vacuum of historical certainty that invited speculation. Imagine the scale, thousands of ships floating, unmoving, vulnerable to the sky. When the typhoon hit, they had nowhere to run. The storm of 1281 has been analysed by modern meteorologists and is now believed to have been a full typhoon, possibly one of the most powerful of its century. The combination of high waves, intense wind, and driving rain would have obliterated a static fleet, especially one carrying animals, weapons, siege equipment, and thousands of men packed in close quarters. Even the best ships of the era would have capsized or broken apart. The poorly coordinated Mongol vessels, many of which were designed more for rivers and lakes than open sea, stood no chance. In the vast world of strange books, few are as bewildering or as beautiful as the Codex Seraphinianus. It's not a hoax, it's not a lost language, it's something far more disorienting. A book that looks like knowledge, behaves like knowledge, and even feels like knowledge, but ultimately tells you nothing you can understand. Published in 1981 by Italian artist Luigi Serafini, the Codex Seraphinianus is a 360-page illustrated encyclopedia of an entirely imaginary world. Its pages are filled with surreal images, bleeding fruit, melting architecture, people transforming into crocodiles, plants that grow into furniture, skeletons kissing inside a bathtub, and insects that resemble machines more than organisms. It is a world that operates by its own internal logic, a place where everything seems slightly familiar and completely alien at the same time. But it's not just the artwork that mystifies. The Codex is written in a flowing cursive script that appears to mimic the structure of actual written language. The script has punctuation, it has headings and subheadings, it aligns in paragraphs and gives the illusion of clarity. Yet, decades after its release, no one has deciphered a single sentence, not because the language is too complex, but because it isn't real. Serafini has admitted that the text is a semic, a form of writing that carries no semantic meaning. It's not code, it's not cipher, it is meant to mimic the feeling of reading, particularly the experience of a child trying to interpret a book written in an adult language. You recognize the shape, the flow, the expectation of understanding, but the meaning always slips away. Why would someone create such a thing? According to Serafini, the book is not a puzzle to be solved, but a visual and cognitive experience. He wanted readers to feel the disorientation, the pure sensation of encountering a book when you don't yet know how to read. In that way, the codex becomes a mirror. It reflects your desire for meaning, your habit of interpretation, and ultimately your frustration at the limits of language. Despite, or because of, its opacity, the Codex Seraphinianus has gained a cult following. Artists, designers, writers, and conspiracy theorists alike have pored over its pages. Some see it as a satire of scientific knowledge, an encyclopedia that parodies the confidence of classification and categorization. Others believe it's a kind of outsider art masterpiece, born from pure imagination untouched by conventional logic or market demands. But not everyone is convinced the book is meaningless. Over the years, some readers have speculated that the Codex contains a hidden layer, an encrypted message, a private mythos, or even a map to some inner vision. They point to recurring symbols, consistent alphabet patterns, and diagrams that seem to correspond to real-world structures. One popular theory suggests that Serafini may have constructed a personal symbolic system, a visual grammar known only to him. In this view, the book is a private language made public, a riddle no one else can truly solve. Then there's the question of when Serafini created the book. He claims to have written it over a 2-year period in the late 1970s, alone in a Roman apartment. But skeptics wonder how one man could produce such a dense, coherent, and deeply detailed work without some guiding schema. The illustrations are not random. They follow themes: botany, zoology, anatomy, technology, architecture, society. Each section echoes the structure of a real encyclopedia. It seems to be a parody of knowledge, yes, but perhaps one that reveals more than it conceals. And therein lies the haunting quality of the Codex Seraphinianus. It exists in the space between meaning and nonsense. It mocks our desire to understand, yet compels us to try. It looks like a key to another world, but no door is ever found. As you turn the pages of the Codex Seraphinianus, a strange realization begins to settle in. The world inside the book is not simply unfamiliar, it's governed by its own alien logic. The illustrations don't just depict nonsense, they suggest systems. They imply order, taxonomy, and culture, but never quite deliver answers. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. The Codex is roughly divided into thematic sections, like a traditional encyclopedia. Only these sections seem to catalogue aspects of a civilization that never existed. The first portion is devoted to the natural world, filled with impossible plants, trees that uproot themselves, flowers that turn into helicopters, vines that loop into geometric patterns. There are fruits that bleed, seeds that hatch into mechanical birds, and fungi that seem to defy gravity. It feels like botany seen through the eyes of someone dreaming, close enough to real, but ultimately off-kilter. Then come the animals. If you didn't know better, you might mistake some of them for actual species, until you notice that they have wheels instead of legs, or their limbs twist into recursive spirals, or their heads grow backward into their own spines. One memorable image shows a couple transforming into alligators mid-embrace. Another depicts a deer-like creature being inflated like a balloon by another organism. There's a sense of underlying narrative here, but it remains just out of reach, like a bedtime story told in a language you almost remember from childhood. The anatomical and biological sections are perhaps the most uncanny. Humanoid figures appear in medical cross-sections, but their organs are abstract. Shapes, spirals, gears, or tubes filled with unknown liquids. A series of diagrams shows a being disassembling itself like a machine, removing its head to reveal a blooming flower, or replacing its legs with roots. The Codex doesn't just distort biology, it reimagines it. In this world, bodies are fluid, interchangeable, and impermanent. But it's not all surreal biology. The later chapters delve into technology, architecture, and culture. Machines appear that look functional yet completely inexplicable. Devices powered by floating orbs, levers made of bones, vehicles shaped like insects. Cities are mapped in impossible geometries, with buildings that curl into themselves or rise on stems like flowers. Roads loop into nowhere. Water flows upward. The built environment seems to reflect a civilization where logic itself has evolved in a different direction. Then there are the rituals. This is where things become truly eerie. Figures dressed in robes, sometimes featureless, are shown engaging in bizarre social ceremonies. In one sequence, a group gathers around a large organic pod, performing an unknown rite that ends with the pod cracking open and emitting light. In another, two people enter a machine and emerge fused into one being. There's a wedding between strange creatures. There's a funeral where the corpse is dissolved into liquid and poured into a container shaped like a leaf. These are not random doodles. They are echoes of culture. They imply myth, religion, tradition, all within a world no one can explain. So what does it all mean? Many interpret the Codex Seraphinianus as a visual metaphor for the limitations of understanding. It imitates knowledge perfectly, the structure, the presentation, the tone, but denies the reader any foothold. The script is asemic, the diagrams are surreal, the facts are unknowable, and yet your brain tries. It searches for patterns. You find yourself constructing meaning where there may be none. That's part of its genius. In some ways, the Codex is a satire of encyclopedic knowledge itself. It reflects how humans love to categorize the world, to box it into charts, words, and systems. But the universe doesn't always cooperate. There are things that defy categorization. The Codex confronts you with that head-on, a world that refuses to yield to understanding, even though it looks like it should. But others see the book as more than metaphor. Some readers believe Serafini has tapped into something deeper, not just imagination, but a kind of universal subconscious. The imagery of the Codex is often compared to dreams, hallucinations, or visions experienced in altered states. It's as if the book is not an invention, but a transmission from a parallel reality, one that mirrors ours, yet follows different laws. Serafini himself has remained enigmatic. He said that he created the book in a trance-like state, letting the images flow without overthinking. He described the writing process as automatic, a term associated with surrealist practices meant to bypass conscious control. He also claims that the book isn't meant to be solved but felt, that it is about the experience of confusion and the joy of letting go of logic. Among the countless relics in religious history, few are as enigmatic or as controversial as the Shroud of Turin. Believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, the shroud is a linen fabric bearing the faint image of a man who appears to have suffered crucifixion. But beyond debates over whether the image was made by miraculous means or medieval trickery, there's a deeper, stranger mystery that has gone largely unaddressed: the shroud's vanishing act. For nearly 150 years, this most sacred object simply disappeared. It's one of the most glaring gaps in religious history. After first appearing in Europe around the mid-14th century, the shroud seemingly had no traceable origin. No records from Jerusalem, no Byzantine relic lists, nothing in Rome. How could such a holy object, supposedly tied to the most pivotal event in Christian faith, the resurrection, go completely unmentioned for over a millennium? Then, in 1354, it suddenly shows up in France, under the control of a knight with murky connections. The question begs itself: where was it all that time, and why did it resurface then? To begin unraveling this puzzle, we need to trace what is known about the shroud before it faded from the spotlight. The first official record comes from a small church in Lire, France, where a nobleman named Geoffroy de Charny presented the cloth as a holy relic. Pilgrims were allowed to view it, and its fame quickly spread, but almost immediately it was met with skepticism. The local bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, launched an investigation and concluded the shroud was a fake, an artistic forgery. His letter to the Pope, written in 1389, claimed an artist had confessed to painting the image, and yet, despite this accusation, the shroud's popularity only grew. Why? Because the image was, and remains, utterly unexplainable. Scientific analysis over the years has failed to definitively determine how it was made. It doesn't behave like paint. The image has no pigment, no brushstrokes, no directionality. It appears to be a negative, like a photograph, long before photography was invented. Let's pause and consider that. A 14-foot linen cloth bearing a photo-negative image of a crucified man appeared out of nowhere in the 1300s. That's enough to ignite debate, but the deeper question is, where was this cloth before 1354? Some believe it never existed prior, that it was simply created in the 14th century, possibly by a skilled artist or alchemist. Others, however, argue that the shroud has a much older origin. They point to descriptions from early Christian and Byzantine writings that refer to mysterious cloths bearing the image of Christ, notably the image of Edessa, also called the Mandylion. The Mandylion was said to be a miraculous image of Jesus' face, transferred to a cloth during his lifetime, and kept in the city of Edessa, modern-day Şanlıurfa in Turkey. According to legend, the cloth protected the city for centuries and was eventually taken to Constantinople in the 10th century. Byzantine records speak reverently of this cloth, describing it as not made by human hands. And here's where it gets interesting. Some modern researchers believe that the Mandylion and the Shroud of Turin are the same artifact, folded in such a way that only the face was visible. If true, that would mean the shroud was not a medieval hoax, but a relic with a continuous history back to the early days of Christianity until it vanished after the sack of Constantinople in 1204. During the Fourth Crusade, Catholic crusaders looted the city, taking countless treasures. Many were never recovered. Some believe the shroud was among them. It's not just speculation. A French knight, Othon de la Roche, who participated in the looting, is rumoured to have taken a sacred linen cloth back to Europe. From there, the trail grows murky. Records are scarce, but certain clues point to the shroud travelling through monasteries and noble families in France, until it ended up with Geoffroy de Charny in Lirey. If Othon de la Roche indeed possessed it, the shroud could have been in his family's protection for over a century before resurfacing. But why hide it? Some say the shroud was simply too controversial. It bore the image of Christ, not painted or drawn, but imprinted in some unknown fashion. That kind of relic would challenge church doctrine, invite accusations of heresy, and perhaps even lead to political strife. Remember, during the 13th and 14th centuries, the church guarded its authority jealously. Unauthorized relics were a direct threat. Others argue the shroud's vanishing was not a matter of secrecy, but of danger. After the sack of Constantinople, possessing such a relic could have drawn attention from rival factions, religious orders, and even royalty. Better to keep it hidden in a monastery or a private chapel than to risk public display. Somewhere in the mists of ancient Britain, a Roman legion vanished without a trace. Not defeated in a legendary battle, not celebrated in epic poetry, just gone. The 9th Legion, or Legio IX Hispana, had been one of Rome's most decorated military units. It earned its name fighting in Spain, built a fearsome reputation crushing revolts, and marched across the empire from Germania to Gaul. But sometime after 108 AD, during the rule of Emperor Trajan, its trail abruptly ends. History stops mentioning it. Roman records fall silent. No official disbandment, no grave markers, no battlefield reports, only an eerie absence. And that silence has given birth to one of Rome's greatest mysteries. By the 1st century AD, the 9th was stationed in Britannia, modern-day Britain, one of Rome's most unruly provinces. The native tribes were fierce, especially in the northern territories, beyond the reach of the empire's cities. The Roman legions had pushed into Scotland, or Caledonia as they called it, but it was hostile territory. Dense forests, rocky terrain, and warriors who fought like ghosts, hitting fast, disappearing faster. The 9th was tasked with holding order in this edge-of-the-world post. Their base was in Eboracum, now known as York. There they built roads, oversaw garrisons, and likely skirmished with local tribes. Yet, there's a chilling gap in the records after their time in Britain. They simply stop appearing in military rosters. Other legions from the same period are meticulously documented, station changes, victories, losses. But the 9th? It's as if history hit the delete key. For centuries, scholars debated whether the legion was destroyed in Britain or reassigned elsewhere. The most popular theory suggests that they marched north in a major campaign against rebellious Caledonian tribes and never came back. No survivors, no returning officers, just silence. Some archaeologists believe the 9th may have been annihilated in a surprise ambush. The Scottish Highlands were perfect terrain for guerrilla warfare. A Roman column, stretched out along a narrow mountain pass, could have been picked apart. If local tribes coordinated a massive uprising, it's conceivable the entire legion was wiped out before messengers could flee. It wouldn't be the first time the empire suffered a devastating loss far from Rome's heart. But if that's what happened, where's the evidence? Mass graves, burned forts, smashed weapons? To date, excavations in northern Britain have not revealed such findings, and Roman chroniclers, usually eager to report heroism or disaster, make no mention of it. Was it covered up, or was it something more complicated? There's a competing theory. The 9th wasn't destroyed, it was transferred. A few fragmented inscriptions suggest that soldiers from the 9th later served in the Rhine region or in the east, near Judea. Could the legion have been quietly moved from Britain to avoid political embarrassment? If a major defeat had occurred, the emperor might have hidden it to preserve his image of power. It's possible the legion was absorbed into another unit or renamed. Ancient Rome was known to shuffle its forces and rewrite inconvenient truths. Then again, the historical timeline throws another wrench into the theory. Hadrian's Wall, the massive stone barrier that once marked the northernmost border of the Roman Empire, began construction just a few years after the 9th's disappearance. Was the wall built to protect against the same threat that may have destroyed the legion? Did their defeat trigger a total rethink of Roman strategy in the north? Some researchers think so. The timing is hard to ignore. If the 9th was indeed destroyed by northern tribes, building a fortified wall would have been the logical next step, not just for defense, but for reputation. The empire couldn't afford another lost legion, but other historians push back. They point to a different possibility. The 9th may have been reassigned to deal with conflicts brewing in the east, where tensions with the Parthian Empire were rising. Evidence is slim but intriguing. A few names of officers linked to the 9th appear years later in places far from Britain. Could a handful of men have survived and been reassigned while the legion was quietly disbanded? Even more intriguing is the idea that the 9th wasn't just lost, but erased. Some believe Rome may have deliberately struck them from the record, not because they failed, but because they disobeyed. A mutiny, perhaps, a refusal to follow orders. In such a case, punishment would be severe, not only in action, but in memory. A vanished legion, unspoken, unacknowledged, consigned to oblivion. And so, the 9th sits in the grey fog between history and myth. Its story refuses to resolve. Too many fragments, too few facts, just enough to provoke doubt, but not enough to give answers. In modern times, the fate of the 9th Legion became more than a historical footnote. It became an obsession. Archaeologists searched the ruins of Britain, hoping for a clue. Writers turned it into legend, and conspiracy theorists, naturally, added their own layers of intrigue. The absence of hard answers only added fuel. One of the key moments in the search came in the 20th century, when a series of Roman tiles stamped with the insignia of the 9th were discovered near York. These artifacts proved that the legion had been stationed in Britain, as expected. But frustratingly, they didn't reveal when or why the legion left. No final dispatch, no account of its last battle, just the faint echo of marching feet on ancient stone. Some of the most compelling clues have come from Vindolanda, a Roman fort located just south of where Hadrian's Wall would eventually stand. There, archaeologists uncovered writing tablets preserved in deep soil, personal letters, supply lists, duty rosters. They offer vivid glimpses into daily life at the frontier, but none mention the 9th. It's as if they were gone before the fort hit its administrative stride. Or worse, never existed in that timeline at all. Historians have scoured Roman records from across the empire, looking for the 9th under different names or designations. Occasionally, a fragment surfaces, an officer who once served in the 9th showing up years later in Germania or Judea. But were these men survivors of a disaster? Or had they merely been reassigned before the legion's disappearance? In literature, the 9th's fate became a powerful metaphor. Rosemary Sutcliffe's 1954 novel, The Eagle of the 9th, turned the legion's story into a heroic quest. In her telling, a young Roman officer travels north beyond the wall to recover the lost eagle standard of the Ninth, a symbol of Rome's honour. It's fiction, but it captured imaginations. So much so that modern films and documentaries took up the thread, blending facts with narrative until the story of the Ninth became half history, half myth. Meanwhile, amateur sleuths have not given up. Armed with satellite images, metal detectors, and a growing network of online forums, history enthusiasts have combed the Scottish countryside looking for signs of a lost battle, buried weapons, armour fragments, mass graves. But each promising find turns out to belong to a different time or place. The trail always leads to another dead end. One of the more outlandish theories suggests the Ninth wasn't defeated, but deserted. Facing impossible odds and isolated in a hostile land, some believe the Legion simply walked away, blended into local tribes, discarded their uniforms, lived out their days in anonymity, leaving no trace behind. It sounds unlikely, but in a world where records were kept by hand and communication travelled at horse speed, it's not beyond imagination. Another possibility, equally chilling, is that the Ninth was quietly destroyed, not by enemies, but by their own empire. If mutiny or insubordination occurred, the punishment could have been swift and silent. Rome had a brutal way of removing embarrassment. Entire units could be condemned, dissolved, their names wiped from stone, erased not just from battlefields, but from history itself. And yet, the lack of closure is what makes the mystery so enduring. In an age where empires left behind endless records, coins, columns, documents, there's a unique hollowness where the Ninth should be. It's not that they were forgotten, it's that they were deliberately left out. Today, the legend of the Ninth lingers far beyond libraries and lecture halls. It's printed into school books, etched into cinema, whispered in history podcasts and reenacted at Roman festivals. It survives, not because we know what happened, but because we don't. That absence pulls at our curiosity like gravity. It invites theories, inventions, dreams. We still don't know if the Ninth was annihilated in a northern ambush, quietly folded into another unit, or made to disappear for political reasons. What we do know is that their story echoes louder for being incomplete. They are a symbol of history's blind spots, of all the lives, battles, and stories that slipped through the cracks of time. Maybe one day, a sword will be found, a plaque buried beneath centuries of soil, a name carved into stone that ties the final chapter together. But until then, the Ninth Roman Legion remains one of antiquity's most compelling vanishings, a reminder that even the mightiest armies can disappear, leaving only questions behind. In the shadowed depths of the Amazon rainforest, where rivers twist like serpents and the trees form an endless emerald sky, a legend took root, one that would captivate explorers, scientists, and dreamers for over a century. They called it the Lost City of Z, a mysterious civilization whispered of in ancient manuscripts and tribal lore, and said to hold secrets that defied all known history. At the heart of this story stood a man named Percy Fawcett, a decorated British officer and renowned explorer. Fawcett had mapped unknown corners of South America and earned a reputation for endurance and precision. But beneath his methodical surface lay a visionary's fire. He believed that deep in the uncharted interior of Brazil lay the ruins of a forgotten people, one that had built temples, roads, and perhaps even a city grander than anything seen in Europe. His conviction didn't come from wild tales, but from a peculiar document discovered in the National Library of Brazil, manuscript 512. It was an 18th century account by Portuguese explorers who claimed to have stumbled upon a vast city hidden in the jungle. The manuscript described arched gates, wide avenues, towering statues, and inscriptions carved in an unknown language. The details were vivid, but the location was vague. No one had ever verified its contents. Still, to Fawcett, it was a beacon. Fawcett believed that Western science had underestimated the peoples of the Amazon. The prevailing view at the time saw the rainforest as a barrier to civilization, too dense, too hostile, too poor in nutrients to support any complex society. But Fawcett disagreed. He had seen pottery shards in remote places, heard native legends of stone ruins swallowed by vines, and spoken with tribes who hinted at ancestral cities long abandoned. To him, the evidence was scattered like breadcrumbs. All it needed was someone willing to follow them. Between 1906 and 1924, Fawcett led several expeditions into the jungle. Each time he ventured farther, mapped unknown rivers, and returned with detailed observations. But what he truly sought always lay just beyond reach. By the time he prepared for what would be his final journey in 1925, he had developed a theory. Z, as he called it, was not only real, but it had once been the center of an advanced society, perhaps even a culture that had influenced civilizations elsewhere. He assembled a small team: his 21-year-old son Jack, Jack's close friend Raleigh Rymel, and a few Brazilian guides. They kept the group deliberately small, believing stealth would protect them from hostile tribes and the dangers of the forest. Fawcett had grown wary of large expeditions, which he saw as clumsy and prone to disaster. In his letters, he was confident. He expected a hard journey, but one that would finally confirm what he had long believed. They departed from the town of Cuiabá and moved into the Mato Grosso region. Fawcett wrote regular dispatches as they progressed, sending messages back through returning guides. His last known communication was a note delivered by an Indian runner. It was dated May 29, 1925, and it reported that the group was continuing northeast. After that, the jungle swallowed them whole. No further message ever came. In the months and years that followed, dozens of search parties tried to locate the missing explorers. Some vanished themselves, others returned with conflicting stories. A few claimed to have found bones or belongings, but nothing definitive ever surfaced. Fawcett had vanished into myth. What happened to him remains uncertain. One theory holds that he and his companions were killed by a hostile tribe. Others believe they died of disease or starvation, trapped in an unfamiliar land with no way out. More romantic theories suggest he found Zed and chose to stay. Some even imagined he had discovered a utopia and had no desire to return to the modern world. Despite the mystery of his disappearance, Fawcett's belief in ancient Amazonian civilizations would slowly gain credibility. For decades, his ideas were dismissed as fantasy. Academics insisted that the rainforest could not support large, complex societies, but recent discoveries have started to overturn that assumption. Archaeological work in the Amazon has revealed vast earthworks, geometric mounds, roads, and settlements once hidden beneath the jungle. Some of these sites are so large they can only be fully seen from the air or through satellite imagery. They show planning, engineering, and social organization that suggest a thriving culture existed long before European arrival. Researchers have uncovered evidence of terra preta, or black earth, soil enriched with charcoal, bones, and organic waste, created deliberately to support agriculture in nutrient-poor regions. This means ancient Amazonians were not passive residents of the jungle. They reshaped it, managed it, and made it bloom. As decades passed, Percy Fawcett's name drifted from newspaper headlines into the realm of legend. His disappearance, unsolved and open-ended, was a fertile ground for speculation. The man who had once charted rivers and mapped borders had become a myth himself, an explorer whose quest blurred the line between obsession and prophecy. But while the public fixated on his fate, the forest he vanished into began whispering clues, not loud ones, but enough to change minds. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new technologies allowed researchers to peer beneath the canopy. With satellite imagery and LiDAR scans, they uncovered geometric patterns carved into the earth. Grids, roadways, circles, and canals too deliberate to be natural. These discoveries weren't isolated. Across hundreds of miles of Amazon basin, similar structures began to emerge. What researchers found challenged the old assumptions. The Amazon had long been seen as untouched wilderness, but the evidence told another story. This rainforest had been shaped, cultivated, and occupied by people in far greater numbers than previously imagined. Some regions showed signs of dense settlement, thousands of inhabitants, intricate farming systems, and widespread trade. The jungle had grown over their homes, but it hadn't erased them entirely. historians began revisiting the idea that early European explorers may have encountered the last remnants of these societies. Some 16th century Spanish and Portuguese records described vast cities, complex road systems, and towering wooden structures. At the time, such accounts were dismissed as exaggeration or colonial fantasy, but now they seemed like forgotten observations of a world vanishing before their eyes. Fawcett's belief that the Amazon once hosted advanced civilizations no longer seemed so far-fetched. He may have misjudged the location, misunderstood the details, or fallen prey to legend, but his central premise, civilization hidden in the forest, was being rediscovered by modern science. The pieces were never missing, they had simply been overgrown. Meanwhile, the mystique around Z continued to evolve. Some imagined it as a singular golden city, something akin to El Dorado. Others thought of it more as a cultural phenomenon, a region with shared knowledge, religious practices, and infrastructure spread across many sites. The truth may lie somewhere in between. While archaeologists made progress on the ground, the broader mystery kept drawing attention. Fawcett's personal journals, recovered from his family, revealed a man deeply idealistic but also methodical. He had a strong spiritual streak and believed in ancient wisdom, but he also relied on careful observation and data. His drive wasn't fueled by gold or glory. It was driven by the conviction that the past held more than textbooks allowed. His disappearance may never be explained. Some accounts from local tribes suggested he was killed after crossing into forbidden territory. Others hinted he died peacefully among the people he admired. One tale claimed that his son Jack married into a tribe, and that Fawcett, old and wounded, chose not to return. None of these stories have been confirmed. No body, no camp, no final message has ever surfaced, yet in a strange way that absence gives the story power. Fawcett didn't fail, he vanished in pursuit of something unknowable, and that is what keeps his legend alive. Unlike explorers who returned with trophies, he left behind a question. What if the jungle still holds truths that defy everything we think we know? Modern expeditions continue. Some search for ruins using aerial surveys and drone footage. Others examine ancient soil layers, searching for signs of long-lost farms or roads. Still others study languages and oral traditions passed down through generations, hoping they preserve echoes of forgotten cities. The lost city of Z may never be found as a single location. It might not be a city at all. It could be a symbol, a reminder that history is incomplete and that the unknown still exists. In a world increasingly mapped and measured, the idea that something vast and significant could still lie hidden under vines and silence feels almost rebellious. That idea, more than the city itself, is what endures. It's the whisper in the leaves, the path beyond the known trail, the sense that somewhere out there, behind rivers no one crosses, and trees that swallow sound, a story waits to be uncovered. Maybe not of kings or treasure, but of people who once thrived in harmony with a landscape we still barely understand. Fawcett may have disappeared, but the questions he raised still ripple outward. What did he find, or fail to find? Did he reach the edge of a vanished world, or was it always just beyond his grasp? And most haunting of all, if something once stood there vast and complex, and nature reclaimed it so completely, what else have we lost? In the cold silence of Greenland's fjords, where the wind hisses through the ruins of turf houses and crumbling churches, a 1,000-year-old mystery lingers. Around the end of the 10th century, Norse settlers, Vikings from Iceland and Norway, sailed across the Atlantic and built colonies on the edge of the known world. For centuries they endured. They raised livestock, farmed the land, built churches of stone, and traded with Europe. Then, without warning, they vanished. No epic battle, no recorded famine, no plague or natural disaster scrawled in sagas or monastic scrolls, just an unsettling emptiness. Archaeologists found abandoned farms, sealed churches, bones buried under frozen soil, but no stories of what finally drove them away. The Greenland Norse were among the most isolated Europeans of their time, and their disappearance is one of the most haunting cold cases in history. It began with a man named Eric the Red, Banished from Iceland for manslaughter, he sailed west around the year 982 and found a land of ice and stone with pockets of green pastures. He named it Greenland, possibly as a marketing tactic to lure settlers, and returned to Iceland with tales of a fertile new world. A few years later, a fleet of settlers followed him. They established two main colonies, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. At their peak, they may have housed over 3,000 people. These Norse Greenlanders were not merely rugged adventurers. They were farmers, herders, and craftsmen. They built homesteads using turf and timber, raised sheep and cattle, and hunted seals. They maintained ties with Europe through occasional trade ships, exporting walrus ivory hides and falcons in exchange for iron tools, luxury goods, and communion wine. They even had bishops. Stone church ruins, such as the Grand Cathedral at Gardar, still stand today as echoes of their ambition and faith. For nearly 500 years, the Greenland Norse endured some of the harshest conditions imaginable. They lived on the razor edge of survival, adapting to a fragile ecosystem. But sometime during the 15th century, both settlements ceased to exist. The Western Settlement vanished first, around 1350. The Eastern Settlement lingered for a few more decades, but by the time a Norwegian priest visited in the 1400s, he found nothing but ruins. Not a single soul remained. What happened? One theory points to climate. The period during which the Norse settled Greenland coincided with what historians call the medieval warm period, a time of relatively mild weather in the North Atlantic. But beginning in the 14th century, global temperatures dropped into what's known as the Little Ice Age. Winters grew longer. Growing seasons shortened. The sea ice thickened, making trade routes unreliable or impassable. Farming became harder. Livestock couldn't graze as long, and hay yields dropped. In a land where food margins were already thin, this change would have been devastating. But climate alone doesn't explain the silence. Famines leave marks, bones with signs of malnutrition, desperate burials, scattered remains. In Greenland, the archaeology doesn't scream catastrophe, it whispers decline. Graves were still being dug right up to the end, with care and ceremony. People didn't seem to flee in haste. They disappeared gradually. Another factor could have been isolation. The Greenland Norse relied on ships from Norway to bring supplies and maintain ties with the church. As the Black Death ravaged Europe in the mid-1300s and Norway's influence waned, those trade voyages slowed, then stopped. Greenland was cut off. With no iron imports, their tools dulled. With no contact, their knowledge of the wider world slipped away. They were Europeans, but they had become ghosts on the map. Some scholars argue that cultural rigidity played a role. The Norse brought with them a European mindset, cattle farming, Christian hierarchy, feudal structure. But Greenland didn't always suit these customs. The Inuit, indigenous people who arrived in Greenland from the north, thrived by hunting sea mammals, building kayaks, and adapting to ice and scarcity. The Norse, by contrast, clung to their identity. They rarely adopted Inuit methods, didn't intermarry, and may have even come into conflict with them. Evidence of Inuit-Norse contact exists: trade goods, stories of skirmishes, shared hunting grounds. But the Norse remained outsiders. When their European support vanished and their environment hardened, they were ill-equipped to survive on their own terms. It's possible that some died, others left, and a few were absorbed into Inuit society, but without written records, it's hard to say. Generations after the last Norse had vanished from Greenland, only traces remained: a stone doorway leading nowhere, a weathered grave with bones curled beneath the soil, names on ancient maps that no longer matched any living place. But the world moved on, and the question of their fate became a quiet echo in history. That silence, however, has continued to invite speculation, and the deeper researchers dig into soil, ice, and story, the more complex the disappearance becomes. In some corners of scholarship, there's a growing belief that the story wasn't one of collapse, but of transformation. The Norse didn't necessarily all perish or flee in despair. Some may have slowly merged into other populations. The Inuit tell oral traditions of tall people, fair-haired and different in their customs. These aren't definitive proof of integration, but they do suggest contact that went beyond hostility. Tools of European origin have been found deep within Inuit territories, sometimes far from any known Norse site. If even a small number of Norse chose to live with the Inuit, to adopt their hunting tools and abandon their old ways, their story might have continued, but in a different language, in different clothing, and across generations that forgot the names of ships and kings.